When Jonathan Roumie saw the 12-year-old girl holding a "Jesus was crazy" sign on that Chicago street corner, he pulled over and said something that touched the deepest part of her heart. His gentle response moved her to unexpected tears and began a conversation so profound it would transform both of them forever. What she asked him at the end left even the man who plays Jesus amazed by God's perfect timing. This isn't just about an actor meeting an angry kid with a protest sign. This is about words spoken with such love that they melted a 12-year-old's defenses, a moment of grace that opened her heart completely, and an encounter so beautiful it proves God orchestrates the most unlikely meetings. What you're about to witness will show you how truth spoken in love can change everything. 3 hours earlier, Sophia Martinez had stormed out of St. Catherine's Catholic School, clutching the poster board she'd stolen from the art supply closet. Her religion teacher, Sister Mary Catherine, had just finished explaining how Jesus was perfect, sinless, and the model for all human behavior, which felt like sandpaper against Sophia's raw wounds. "If Jesus is so perfect," she had shouted at the nun, "then why didn't he stop my dad from leaving?" The classroom had fallen silent, 23 pairs of eyes staring at the girl whose father had abandoned their family 6 months ago, leaving behind only unpaid bills and a daughter who blamed God for not intervening. Sister Mary Catherine had tried to comfort her with gentle words about God's plan and mysterious ways, but Sophia was past the point of comfort. She grabbed her backpack and ran from the school, her mind spinning with anger and a plan that felt like justice. If Jesus was supposed to be so loving and powerful, why did good people suffer while bad people seemed to get away with everything? The poster board became her weapon of choice, and with a thick red marker she'd found in her mother's purse, she crafted her declaration of war against a God who had let her down when she needed him most. The busy intersection of Clark and Diversey seemed like the perfect stage for her rebellion, with hundreds of people passing by every hour. Sophia positioned herself on the corner, holding her sign high and glaring at anyone who dared to make eye contact. Most people averted their gaze and hurried past, but a few stopped to take pictures with their phones, which only fueled her determination. She had been standing there for 2 hours when a beat-up Honda Civic with Illinois plates pulled up to the red light, and the driver did something that caught her completely off guard. The man behind the wheel wasn't looking at his phone or rushing to his next appointment like everyone else. Instead, he was staring directly at her sign with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not anger, not shock, but something that looked almost like recognition. When the light turned green, instead of driving away, he pulled over to the curb and stepped out of his car. Sophia's heart began to race as she realized this stranger was walking straight toward her, but something about his calm demeanor kept her feet planted firmly on the sidewalk. "That's quite a statement you've got there," Jonathan said as he approached, his hands visible and non-threatening. "I'm Jonathan, and I've actually spent some time thinking about Jesus myself." Sophia raised her chin defiantly, expecting him to launch into a lecture about respect and blasphemy like the adults at school. "You some kind of preacher or something?" she asked, her voice carrying the practiced hostility of someone who had been disappointed too many times. Jonathan smiled, and there was something genuine about it that made her defenses waver slightly. "Actually, I'm an actor," Jonathan replied, settling into a comfortable position, leaning against a nearby lamppost. "I played Jesus in a show called The Chosen, so I guess you could say I've been researching him pretty intensively for the past few years." Sophia's eyes widened slightly. She had heard of the show, though she'd never watched it. "So you're like famous?" she asked, momentarily forgetting her anger in the face of her first celebrity encounter. Jonathan chuckled and gestured to his 15-year-old Honda and his thrift store jacket. "Famous is a strong word, but some people know the show, yeah?" "Well, then you should be mad at me," Sophia said, holding her sign higher and trying to reclaim her rebellious stance. "I'm saying the guy you pretend to be was crazy." Jonathan nodded thoughtfully, as if he were genuinely her perspective, if rather than dismissing it outright. "You know what, Sophia?" he said, though she hadn't told him her name yet. The fact that he somehow knew it should have been alarming, but instead it felt strangely comforting. How do you know my name? She asked, lowering the sign slightly. Jonathan pointed to the school name embroidered on her uniform polo shirt, then to the small name tag still clipped to her backpack from a recent field trip. St. Catherine's, and your name tag, he explained with a gentle smile. Plus, you have the look of someone who's been wrestling with some pretty big questions lately. His observation hit closer to home than Sophia was comfortable with, and she felt her carefully constructed armor beginning to crack. So what if I have been? She challenged, though her voice had lost some of its earlier venom. Nothing wrong with having questions, especially about important stuff. Jonathan's response surprised her with its matter-of-fact tone. Actually, I think questioning things shows you're taking them seriously, he continued. The people who worry me are the ones who never question anything at all. This wasn't the response Sophia had been expecting from someone who made a living portraying the Son of God. But you still think I'm wrong about Jesus being crazy, right? Sophia pressed, studying his face for signs of the judgment she was sure would come. Jonathan was quiet for a moment, watching the traffic flow past them while he seemed to consider his words carefully. Well, let me ask you something first, he said, turning back to face her. What made you decide Jesus was crazy? What's your evidence? Sophia hadn't expected to be asked for evidence, and for a moment she fumbled with her thoughts. Well, he claimed to be God, didn't he? She said, finding her footing again. And he talked to people who weren't there, and he said he could forgive sins, and he let people kill him, even though he supposedly had all this power. Her argument sounded reasonable to her own ears, the kind of logical thinking that her science teacher always encouraged. Jonathan listened intently, nodding along as if he were taking notes on her reasoning. Those are really good points, Jonathan said, which wasn't what Sophia had expected at all. Those behaviors would definitely seem pretty crazy by most standards. He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. But here's the thing that's been bugging me about that theory, he continued. I've been studying this guy Jesus for years now, reading everything about him, and the more I learn, the more I realize something doesn't add up with the crazy explanation. What do you mean? Sophia asked, genuinely curious despite herself. Jonathan gestured to a nearby bus stop bench, and after a moment's hesitation she followed him over and sat down. Well, think about it, he said. Crazy people usually have pretty chaotic thinking, right? Their ideas don't really connect. They're unpredictable. They can't maintain relationships. Sophia nodded, thinking of her uncle who struggled with mental illness and whose thoughts often jumped from topic to topic without any clear connection. But when you read what Jesus actually said and did, his thinking is incredibly consistent, Jonathan continued. His teachings all connect to each other. He maintained deep friendships, and even his enemies admitted he was brilliant. Sophia frowned, not wanting to give up her position so easily. But what about all the supernatural stuff, she countered. Walking on water, bringing dead people back to life? That's crazy talk. Jonathan smiled, and she could see he was enjoying the debate rather than feeling threatened by it. You know what's funny? Jonathan said. I used to think the same thing. Before I started playing Jesus, I thought all that supernatural stuff was just metaphor or legend or wishful thinking. Sophia looked at him with surprise. She hadn't expected this level of honesty from someone who portrayed Jesus for a living. So what changed your mind? She asked, leaning forward slightly. Research, Jonathan replied simply. And some experiences I can't really explain. What kind of experiences? Sophia pressed, her scientific curiosity getting the better of her skepticism. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, as if deciding how much to share with a 12-year-old he'd just met. Well, there was this time when we were filming a scene where Jesus heals a blind man, he began. It was just acting, you know? Just pretend. But there was this extra on set, an older guy who had been legally blind for 30 years. Sophia felt a chill run down her spine, though she couldn't explain why. During the lunch break, he came up to me and asked if I would pray for him, Jonathan continued, his voice growing quieter. Not because he thought I was actually Jesus, but because he said something about the way I'd been portraying him felt real to him. Sophia found herself holding her breath, waiting for the rest of the story. So I prayed for him. Feeling kind of awkward about it, to be honest, Jonathan said. And when he opened his eyes, he could see. The words hung in the air between them, like a challenge to everything Sophia thought she knew about reality. "That's impossible," Sophia said, but her voice lacked conviction. "People don't just suddenly get their sight back after 30 years. Jonathan nodded understandingly. "I thought so too. We all did. The medical team on set examined him, the doctors at the hospital ran tests, and nobody could explain it." He looked directly into her eyes. "But here's the thing, Sophia. Impossible things happen around Jesus all the time, even today." She felt something stirring in her chest, a mixture of fear and curiosity that she didn't want to acknowledge. "But even if that really happened," Sophia said, grasping for her earlier certainty, "it doesn't prove Jesus isn't crazy. Maybe he's crazy in a way that somehow works." Jonathan laughed, and the sound was warm and genuine. "You know what? You might be onto something there," he said. "Maybe Jesus is crazy, but maybe he's the kind of crazy the world desperately needs." This wasn't the direction Sophia had expected the conversation to go, and she found herself intrigued despite her determination to stay angry. "Think about it," Jonathan continued, warming to his theme. "In a world where people hoard wealth while others starve, Jesus says give everything to the poor. That's pretty crazy." Sophia nodded, remembering her mother's struggle to pay rent after her father left. "In a world where people seek revenge and hold grudges, Jesus says, forgive your enemies and pray for people who hurt you. That's definitely crazy." She thought about how angry she still was at her father, and how the idea of forgiving him seemed impossible. And in a world where people judge each other constantly, Jesus says love everyone unconditionally, completely insane by normal standards. "So you're saying Jesus was crazy, but in a good way?" Sophia asked, trying to process this new perspective. "I'm saying maybe the problem isn't that Jesus was crazy," Jonathan replied. "Maybe the problem is that the rest of us are crazy, and Jesus was the only sane person in an insane world." The words hit Sophia like a physical blow, rearranging everything she thought she understood about sanity and logic. She looked down at her sign, and the bold red letters suddenly seemed less certain, less powerful. "But what about my dad?" Sophia blurted out, the question that had been driving her anger finally escaping. "If Jesus is so loving and powerful, why didn't he keep my family together?" Her voice cracked on the last words, and she felt tears threatening to spill over. Jonathan's expression softened with genuine compassion. "Oh, Sophia," he said gently, "I'm so sorry. That must hurt so much." The kindness in his voice broke something loose inside her chest, and the first tears began to fall. "He just left," Sophia whispered, the words coming out in a rush. "One day he was there, and the next day he was gone, and he won't even answer my calls." Jonathan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small package of tissues, offering them to her without comment. "My mom cries every night, and I can hear her through the walls, and I prayed and prayed for God to bring him back, but nothing happened." The pain in her voice was raw and immediate, the kind of hurt that comes from a child's broken trust. "So, where was Jesus then? Where was all his love and power when I really needed it?" Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, and Sophia could see him choosing his words carefully. "You know what, Sophia? I don't know where Jesus was when your dad left," he said finally. "I don't understand why God allows people to hurt each other, especially when kids get caught in the middle." His honesty surprised her. She had expected platitudes about God's plan and everything happening for a reason. If you're still here watching this conversation that's changing everything, if you've ever felt abandoned by God when you needed him most, go ahead and like this video and comment the word honesty below. Let's see how many of us believe it's okay to bring our real questions and pain to God. "But I do know one thing," he continued. "Jesus knows exactly how you feel right now." She looked up at him through her tears, confused by this statement. "Jesus had a dad who wasn't there for him too," Jonathan explained gently. "Not in the same way as your situation, but when Jesus was dying on the cross, he cried out, 'My God, why have you forsaken me?'" Sophia had never heard this part of the Jesus story, and it struck her as strangely comforting. "He felt abandoned, just like you do," Jonathan continued. "He felt like his father had left him when he needed him most. The parallel between her situation and Jesus's experience was something she had never considered, and it made her chest feel less tight. "So Jesus understands what it feels like when your dad doesn't show up?" Sophia asked, wiping her nose with one of Jonathan's tissues. "He understands what it feels like when the person who's supposed to protect you and love you just isn't there when you need them most." Jonathan's words carried the weight of personal experience, and Sophia wondered what pain he might be carrying in his own life. "And maybe," he continued, "maybe that's part of why Jesus is so passionate about taking care of people who are hurting." She found herself leaning closer, drawn in by this new way of thinking about the figure she had been protesting against. "But why doesn't he just fix everything?" Sophia pressed, still struggling with the fundamental question that had driven her to make the sign. If Jesus has all this power, why doesn't he just make people stay together and love each other properly? Jonathan sighed, and she could see this was a question he had wrestled with himself. "I think," he said slowly, "it's because love that's forced isn't really love at all." The concept was complex for a 12-year-old, but something about it resonated with her understanding of relationships. Your dad had to choose to stay, and for whatever reason, he chose differently. "That doesn't make it hurt less," Sophia said, her voice small and vulnerable. "No, it doesn't," Jonathan agreed. "And I think that's exactly why Jesus cares so much about people who are hurting." He paused, seeming to consider whether to share something personal. "Can I tell you something about my own dad?" he asked. Sophia nodded, grateful for the shift away from her own pain for a moment. "My dad died when I was young, and I spent years being angry at God about it," Jonathan continued. "I felt abandoned, just like you do." "What happened?" Sophia asked, sensing this was an important part of Jonathan's story. "I blamed God for taking him away, and I decided that if God existed at all, he was either powerless or cruel," Jonathan said. "I spent years running from anything that had to do with faith or religion." Sophia could relate to this feeling of wanting to run from God, and she found herself hanging on his every word. "But then, something happened that changed everything," he continued. "I realized that my anger at God was actually proof that I believed in him." This paradox made Sophia's head spin slightly as she tried to process it. "How is being angry at God proof that you believe in him?" she asked, genuinely puzzled. "Because you can't be angry at someone who doesn't exist," Jonathan explained with a gentle smile. "I was furious at God because deep down I expected him to be good and loving and protective." Sophia felt a strange recognition in these words, as if Jonathan was describing her own heart back to her. "And when bad things happened, it felt like betrayal, because I knew God was supposed to be better than that." She realized that her anger at Jesus, her need to make the sign and stand on this corner, came from the same place of disappointed expectation. "So you're saying that being angry at Jesus means I actually believe in him?" Sophia asked, the irony not lost on her. "I'm saying that the fact that you're holding that sign, that you care enough to be angry, suggests that Jesus matters to you more than you might want to admit." Jonathan replied, "People don't usually get upset about fictional characters unless those characters represent something real and important to them." Sophia looked down at her sign again, seeing it now as evidence of faith rather than evidence of rebellion. The realization was both disturbing and oddly comforting. "But I still don't understand why God lets bad things happen to good people," Sophia said, voicing the question that had been haunting her for months, especially to kids who didn't do anything wrong. Jonathan nodded, acknowledging the weight of her question. "You know what, Sophia? I don't think anyone fully understands that," he said. "But I've learned something about Jesus that helps me when I'm struggling with that question." She waited for him to continue, desperate for any insight that might ease the confusion in her heart. "Jesus didn't just stand on the sidelines watching people suffer," Jonathan explained. "He jumped right into the middle of human pain and experienced all of it himself." Sophia considered this, thinking about the stories she had heard in religion class about Jesus' life. He was born poor, he was misunderstood by his family, he was betrayed by his friends, and he died a painful death, Jonathan continued. "So when you're hurting, Jesus isn't watching from a safe distance. He's right there with you because he's been where you are." This image of Jesus as a fellow sufferer rather than a distant judge was entirely new to Sophia, and it began to shift something fundamental in her understanding. So when my dad left and I felt abandoned, Jesus felt that too? Sophia asked, testing this new framework. When I felt like nobody understood or cared, Jesus understood because he had felt the same thing? Jonathan's eyes filled with compassion as he nodded. And when you made that sign because you were angry and hurt and confused, Jesus understood that too, because he asked his own hard questions when he was suffering. Sophia felt a strange warmth spreading through her chest as if something frozen was beginning to thaw. In fact, Jonathan added quietly, I think Jesus might look at your sign and think, finally, someone who's honest about how hard this all is. The idea that Jesus might actually appreciate her honesty rather than condemn her rebellion was revolutionary to Sophia. So you don't think he's mad at me for saying he's crazy? She asked uncertainly. I think he's probably glad that you care enough to wrestle with who he is, instead of just ignoring him completely. Jonathan replied. The people Jesus got frustrated with in the Bible weren't the ones who questioned him. It was the ones who pretended to have all the answers but didn't really love anybody. This distinction had never been made clear to Sophia in all her years of religious education, and it felt like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known existed. Jonathan, Sophia said, using his name for the first time, can I ask you something else? He nodded encouragingly. If you were me, and you were angry at Jesus because your dad left, what would you do? The question carried all the weight of her confusion and pain, and she could see that Jonathan understood how much his answer mattered to her. I think, he said carefully, I would tell Jesus exactly how I felt, even if it wasn't pretty or polite. Sophia's eyes widened at this suggestion. You mean like pray angry prayers? I mean like being completely honest with God about everything you're feeling, Jonathan explained. Jesus can handle your anger, Sophia. He's not going to be shocked or offended by your pain. The permission to bring her full, messy self to God was something Sophia had never been given before. In fact, Jonathan continued, I think he's been waiting for you to talk to him about it instead of just talking about him to other people. As he spoke these words, something extraordinary began to happen. The traffic noise around them seemed to fade, and Sophia felt a presence she couldn't explain. Warm, accepting, and infinitely patient. Do you feel that? Sophia whispered, looking around as if she might see someone standing nearby. Jonathan smiled, and she could see in his eyes that he felt it too. That's Jesus, Sophia, he said gently. He's been here the whole time, waiting for you to notice him. Tears began to flow down her face again, but these felt different from the angry tears she had shed earlier. He's not mad at me for the sign? She asked, her voice barely audible. Sweetheart, he's just glad you're finally talking to him, Jonathan replied, and somehow Sophia knew with absolute certainty that this was true. Without fully understanding why, Sophia found herself lowering the sign to the ground and closing her eyes. Jesus, she whispered, I'm really mad at you right now, and I don't understand why you let my dad leave. The words felt dangerous and rebellious, but also strangely relieving. And I'm scared that my mom is going to break completely, and I don't know how to fix any of this. Jonathan placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, and she could feel his silent support. But Jonathan says you understand how I feel, and if that's true, then maybe you can help me figure out what to do next. As Sophia spoke her honest prayer on the busy street corner, something shifted in the atmosphere around them. The presence she had sensed grew stronger, more tangible, and she felt surrounded by a love so complete that it took her breath away. I feel him, she gasped, opening her eyes to look at Jonathan in wonder. I actually feel Jesus here with us. Jonathan's face was radiant with joy and unshed tears. He's always been here, Sophia, he said softly. You just needed to stop running from him long enough to notice. The transformation in her heart was so immediate and profound that she could hardly believe it was real. What do I do now? Sophia asked, looking down at the sign that had brought them together. Do I throw this away? Do I pretend I was never angry? Jonathan shook his head. No, I think you keep it, he said, surprising her. Keep it as a reminder that God can handle your questions and your anger, and that sometimes the most honest prayers start with admitting how lost we feel. Sophia picked up the sign and looked at it with new eyes. Maybe I could change it, she suggested. Maybe it could say something different. Jonathan reached into his car and pulled out a black marker, offering it to her with a smile. What would you want it to say instead? He asked. Sophia thought for a moment, then knelt down on the sidewalk and began to write. When she finished, the sign read, Jesus was crazy. Crazy enough to love people like me. She held it up for Jonathan to see, and the grin that spread across his face was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. Now that, he said, is a sign I think Jesus would be proud to see. The transformation from protest to proclamation felt like a miracle in itself. As they stood together on the corner, Sophia holding her newly transformed sign, other pedestrians began to notice the change. Several people stopped to read the revised message, and a few even smiled or nodded approvingly. You know what's amazing? Jonathan observed. You're still telling people about Jesus, but now you're sharing good news instead of bad news. Sophia realized he was right. Her honest journey from anger to acceptance was actually a form of testimony that might reach people who had never been touched by traditional religious messages. Maybe this is what Jesus meant when he said we should become like little children, she mused. I should probably get home, Sophia said reluctantly, glancing at her phone and realizing how much time had passed. My mom will be worried about me. Jonathan nodded understandingly, but before she left, he had one more thing to share. Sophia, can I tell you something important about your dad? She looked at him curiously. Jesus understands that your dad leaving wasn't about you not being worth staying for, Jonathan said carefully. Sometimes adults make decisions based on their own broken places, and it has nothing to do with how wonderful their children are. These words touched a wound Sophia hadn't even realized she was carrying. Do you think Jesus can help my dad too? Sophia asked, the question revealing how much her heart had expanded in the past hour. Even though he hurt me and my mom? Jonathan's smile was full of hope. I think Jesus specializes in helping broken people, Sophia, he said. And I think your prayers for your dad might be exactly what he needs right now. The idea that she could pray for her father instead of just being angry at him felt like a new superpower she was just discovering. Maybe being mad at Jesus about my dad was actually the first step toward praying for both of them, she realized. In the months that followed, Sophia's transformation rippled outward in ways she never could have anticipated. She became known at St. Anne's Catherine's as the girl who asked the hard questions in religion class. But now her questions came from a place of genuine seeking rather than defensive anger. Sister Mary Catherine often asked her to share her insights with younger students who were struggling with their own doubts and fears. Her sign, which she kept in her bedroom as a reminder, became a conversation starter with friends who had their own complicated relationships with faith. Most remarkably, Sophia's honest prayers for her father began to bear fruit in unexpected ways. 3 months after her encounter with Jonathan, her dad called for the first time since leaving, wanting to talk to her about some changes he was making in his life. While their relationship remained complicated, and his return to the family was uncertain, the conversation was a beginning that Sophia recognized as an answer to prayer. She had learned that sometimes God's response to our deepest hurts comes not as instant healing, but as the strength to love and hope in the midst of ongoing pain. If you've ever felt angry at God, if you've ever questioned whether faith makes any sense in a world full of suffering, remember Sophia's story. Sometimes our anger at Jesus is actually proof that we believe he should be good, loving, and present in our lives. And sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is be honest with God about our doubts and pain, trusting that he's big enough to handle our questions and loving enough to meet us in our anger. What would happen if you stopped running from God and started running toward him with all your messy, complicated, honest feelings? If this story touched your heart, hit that subscribe button for more inspiring faith stories that show God's love in unexpected places. And in the comments below, share your own moment when anger or doubt led you to a deeper understanding of faith. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Maybe it's time to find out.